I'm Brian Christner, and this is The Byte, a bite-sized podcast about containers, cloud, and tech. Today we're going to talk about Visual Studio Code and working with Docker. Now, I took a short survey of some of my colleagues and people using Visual Studio Code, and I asked them, first, do you have the Docker extension installed? Yes or no? And most people had the extension installed, which is not a surprise. But the next question is were people using the extension to its fullest capabilities? And surprisingly, most people were not using it nearly as it was intended. Most people were just using it for linting, syntax checking, etc. But even then, they weren't using some of the features to validate or pull up the commands of Docker files, etc. So in this podcast, we're going to shortly describe the Docker extension and what you can do with this Docker extension besides just doing normal syntax checking. So first and foremost, we could do Docker files. So in the Docker file, we can create a normal Docker file as we have in the past, but then we can bring up like the command snippet, and we can actually bring up every different command file available within the Docker file. So for example, the first line in the Docker file is from. You can see the exact argument, etc. So you can see the whole list of all the possibilities of a Docker file, of compose files, etc. So you don't have to constantly be searching the Docker docs for the different possibilities. It's all right there within your editor. So when you do in the Mac, it's a control space. I would imagine in Windows it would be control space as well, and it brings up the list of all the possibilities for the Docker file. Now the next is who has generated a Docker file using Visual Studio Code. Now this is something new to me because I was actually investigating an issue that I found with Visual Studio Code and Docker, and it was just driving me nuts. And I came across some documentation, is actually, read the manual type of documentation about generating Docker files. Now in Visual Studio Code, you can actually generate a Docker file and it does it automatically. And for example, the .NET applications, if you have a .NET application and you generate the Docker file, it actually does a multi-stage build for you automatically. I mean, the amount of time you spend trying to do this by yourself is a few hours, where Visual Studio Code just generates it on the fly for you. So to do this, to generate your own Docker file, you just use Command P in Mac or Windows P. It brings up the command palette, and in the command palette, we can just do Docker, type Docker, add Docker files to workspace, and then you can choose which workspace you want to use, and it takes everything in your local directory and it actually builds the Docker file. Then it prompts you for what language do you want to use. It says Go, Java, .NET, etc. And then what port will your application be listening on. And once you hit enter, it actually generates a Docker compose file, a Docker file, and a debug file, all for you right out of the bat. Now obviously it's probably not production ready, but it's a good starting point. It's a good basis to get up and running with your Docker files. So next time you start a project, instead of starting from scratch, I recommend using Visual Studio Code to actually generate your Docker file, Docker compose file directly for you. Give it a try. I mean, I'm really surprised by the success of this. And like I said, I've written some multi-stage files in the past, and I've compared it to the Docker extension, and it does a very good job. The next thing you can do within Visual Studio Code is actually do Docker commands directly within the Visual Studio Code. So again, Command P in Mac or Windows P in Windows, and you could do type Docker and then, for example, run, or Docker. Just think of all the different Docker commands, and it actually generates the command directly in the terminal in Visual Studio Code, and you can run it right there. I mean, this is quite cool. The next thing you can do is in the Docker Explorer. So if you click on the Docker extension on the left-hand side on the menu bar, you can see images, containers, etc. Now, what's interesting is you can see the containers that are running, so you can interact with these containers. Now, what's really cool that I found is if you right-click on one of the containers, you can attach to the console. So then it generates exactly the console command to connect to it. It figures out what kind of container it is, and it consoles right into it. So you don't have to do a Docker PS to find out what the name of it is, and etc. So it's a bit quicker to do it this way. Additionally, you can look at the logs for a container. Right click on the container, logs, and again, it generates the command, it puts the command there. What I found quite helpful is when I'm writing within the Visual Studio, doing compose, whatever, and I want to test what I'm doing. And I do like a Docker compose build. So then I do Command P, Docker, and type Docker compose build, and it builds it. It does the complete command for me, and it just builds it right there in my terminal. And the advantage I'm finding with using Visual Studio Code is you're not context switching. You're not switching between your editor and your terminal all the time. So it's actually really helping with my workflow. I would really encourage everyone to give it a try. I mean, maybe you won't use all the features within it, but just give some of these new ones a try, because I was pleasantly surprised how good it is. I'm going to explore some other extensions and let you know, but so far I'm very impressed with the Docker extension. So that's the time for today. Thank you very much, and we'll see you at the next episode. Have a great day.
Thank you for listening to this episode of The Byte. You can find the show notes at thebyte.io and follow me on Twitter at IDoMyOwnTricks.
The podcast you just heard was made using Anchor. Ever thought about making your own podcast? Anchor makes it really easy for anyone to get started. It's a one-stop shop for recording, hosting, and distributing podcasts. Best of all, it's 100% free. Sign up now at anchor.fm/new. That's anchor.fm/new to get started.